This is TWiT.
Well, I feel like I need a drink after that.
You ready for a drink?
Yes.
I can hook you up. This was
Okay.
a gift for my visit and my visits to Copenhagen, where I ended up doing 4 different shows in 2 weeks. And this is the Thornæs Danish single malt. So we're back to doing the sort of farm to bottle thing in Denmark again. We had TWiT just last week. And TWiT is in the far northwestern corner of Denmark. But this time we're going to go to Kagerup. And Kagerup is in the far eastern part of Denmark, nice and close to Sweden, about 50 kilometers north of Copenhagen. This is an area, the overall area on that part of the country, called North Zealand. No, not New Zealand, North Zealand, as in sea land. They're surrounded by the Baltic right there. And there have been humans there literally since the end of the Ice Age. The Maglemosians, the Kongamus, the Ertebal cultures, like 4,000, 7,000 BC, like right from the very beginning. And then, just like we talked about with the TWiT, you get to the funnel beaker people who come into the area in the Neolithic times, somewhere around 4,000 BC, with emmer wheat and barley. Interesting about the Zealand zone specifically, their archaeology, read this great paper on this, was there's this period between 3,500 and 2,300 BC where a new group of folks move in, and they don't push out the funnel beaker people per se. This was the pitted ware people. It's all descriptions of their pottery, right? And they were actually hunter-gatherers, but they were marine hunter-gatherers. So it was fishing, sealing, shellfish, and they just sort of moved around, where the funnel beaker people who were farming were a little more inland. So the two groups live side by side, just in different ecosystems. The coastal lands aren't particularly good for growing wheat and barley, and the hunter-gatherers just keep moving around. So, and things are pretty stable like that for hundreds of years until you get to the beginning of the copper and bronze age, the Paleolithics, because that explodes trade, right? The tin was so rare. The copper is pretty plentiful. You can find it wherever, but tin is hard to come by. And one of the big sources of tin is southwest Britain. And so there's tin being brought from southwest Britain in through what is now France and onto the river system. And that starts to construct trade routes all the way to the Eastern Mediterranean, where the Bronze Age is really going to go big. And as those trade routes, all river-based driven, explode, everything that's tradable becomes important. And Denmark has amber. Now, the amber comes from the seafloor of the Baltic Sea, an ancient, huge forest that was submerged when the Baltic Sea appeared as the end of the Ice Age came along, buried all of this wood for so long that it became fossilized. And this amber literally pops off the seafloor and floats ashore in routine. This still happens today. I've been in places along the coast of Lithuania where they routinely find chunks of amber. And amber was hugely prized by the Mediterranean folks. And so Denmark becomes a key part of a trade route. So they get the bronze. They're trading down the amber, this Nordic gold, as it's referred to. But the Bronze Age ends, and the Bronze Age collapsed around 1200 BC or so. But that, in the Eastern Mediterranean, was quite catastrophic. The Egyptians, the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, and so forth, became a famine. There were we had the Sea People raids. Like, it's a massive collapse. And that's not what happened in Denmark. In Denmark, the trade just faded away. And so the sort of wealthy culture that emerged, that built large mounds for their rich people, that kind of thing, stops for a few hundred years. It just becomes kind of quiet until you get to around the first Iron Age cultures, the Hallstatt cultures, that make their way up to the Nordics. Now, why the Iron Age comes after the Bronze Age? Well, it's mostly metallurgy. Bronze is just a alloy of tin and copper. Tin melts at like 250 degrees C, no big deal. But copper, you got to get up to over 1,000 degrees to actually melt it, which is tough. You've got to use charcoal, you've got to use bellows to get that kind of heat. And once you alloy them together and make bronze, it actually has a lower melting point than copper has on own, about 950. And you can, once you get it molten, you can cast tools from this. Typically axe heads are the most common thing, but also sickles, because you're cutting wheat, right, and cutting iron. Iron's melting point is 1,500 degrees Celsius, and that is really, really hot. It's very hard to get that high temperature. And you need to get that high to get the impurities out. Most iron ores are heavily contaminated. You need to remove the slag. But there was a discovery made that around 1100, 1200 degrees or so, the iron ores become malleable enough that you can start to hammer them and make what's called bloomery iron. And bloomery iron is not got all the slag out of it, but if you keep folding and pounding it, you can get some usable metal from it. It's not real hard. It won't hold edges particularly well, but for simple tools, it's workable. And iron is far more common than copper and tin. So you get this early Iron Age with these softer tools. You're probably still going to use bronze for your finer edges, for your sickles and swords and things like that. But light-duty tools start to emerge in iron. It's not going to be until about 500 BC that bronze really gets replaced once and for all as we learn to make higher temperature kilns and start to actually melt things, which also very much changes that part of the world. Because as you get more iron tools, you get far more agriculture. You can produce a lot more food. And so there's a series of iron ages that happen in this world. There is a period we call the Roman Iron Age, and that's from beginning of AD up to about 400, although the Romans never made it that far, but their goods did. And then as the Romans collapse, you have what they call the Germanic Iron Age from about 400 to 800 AD until you reach ultimately the age of the Vikings. And iron was a huge part of the Viking Age because as iron tools proliferated and their ability to make them became so common, agriculture grew to the point where you had overpopulation problems. And when you have too many people, you put them on boats and get them to go visit other people and kill them. Winding down out of the Viking Age into the medieval age, we now start talking about this land where Kagerup is located, specifically Gribskov, which is in the northwest corner of North Zealand. And even in the Viking Age, so you're talking over 1,000 years ago, it was a managed forest. They were routinely harvesting timber from it, but in a manageable way. And it was a hunting preserve and also areas for grazing pigs and things like that. And by the medieval period, it becomes a royal hunting forest. So as the kings emerge and wealth emerges, again, they are protecting this forest the whole time. And even today, it's still an important forested area in the northwest of North Zealand. So as you come into the modern age where we start to talk about this particular distillery, there is the Falkendale farm, Falkendale meaning the Falcon Valley, and raptors are common in this part of the world. And the Falkendale farm has been in operation since the late 1800s. This is all phenomenal barley growing country, cool marine climate, mild seasons. Winters aren't too cold, summers aren't too hot. And we bring us to our story of actually making a distillery. And this is a guy named Torben Thornæs Andersen, and the distillery is called the Thornæs Distillery. This guy's not a whiskey guy per se. He's just a fan. He was educated as a copywriter and an author and a journalist, and he loved his whiskey and toured around Scotland a fair bit. And then he got this idea, as he admits himself, that he wanted to make his own 12-year-old whiskey before he turned 60. And with all of the relationships he'd made in the Scottish Highlands and Speyside, he sort of got going on that. Now, while he was from Copenhagen, he chose North Zealand as an ideal place to make whiskey because of the farms, the availability of barley, and excellent water. So he rented an old horse stable that was on the Falkendale farm. It was a bit of a derelict. It actually had a fire 20 years earlier, and the farmer didn't have the means to restore it and wasn't really keeping horses anyway, so the building had just been left as it was. And so he raised enough funds to actually repair the building and assemble the first distillery in North Zealand, producing a single malt, an organic single malt. First production is in 2019, so this is all very recent. And Thomas's focus was on totally manual operations, no automation, running a team for quite some time, just 3 people. They have a few more now. And while they always bought barley from Denmark, it's only just recently that they're producing enough barley on the Falkendale farm itself to be part of the process. They don't own the farm. They're just renting the space on it. The farm is still in operations. First casks get laid up in 2020. Of course, they want to wait at least 3 years. And even at 3 years old, it's not going to be that good. So they go for very small casks, as little as 50 liters, tiny little barrels, which means quick maturation because lots of contact with the wood, but also a lot of angel share loss. So it's kind of expensive way to go. It's a small operation, 1,600 liter mash tun. That's tiny. They do very long fermentations. Generally speaking, your yeast has done its thing in 48 hours. But if you leave it in, and this is what these guys do, 140-hour ferments to let the trailing edge, at least in some of the lactose, to actually kick off to richen up the flavor as well. They do use traditional distiller's yeast. This is not Belgium. This is Denmark. And the leftover mash, after they've done the extractions from it, they actually spread along the forest edges to feed the local wildlife. There's not a lot of farm animals here.
That's nice.
Yeah, it's good. 3 small stills, 2 wash stills, and 1 spirit still, all about 1,000 liters apiece. These are round, bulbous, squat necks and short lie arms. They do very slow distillation runs, 10 plus hours per run. And when I was talking about TWiT just last week, those were 6-hour runs. So you can get the idea. They're going after real oily textures and lots of grain notes, that kind of flavor profile. In general, they do barreling in bourbon and reconditioned barrels, as well as sherry casks, and they have local storage for hundreds of casks. That's largely open air, so they get the temperate climate into there. But we're talking specifically about this edition called the Kagerup edition. It's on the side, and it says very specifically Sherry Oloroso. This was distilled in 2021 and bottled in 24, so it's only 3 years old, and it was aged in a single Oloroso sherry cask. The cask called MW009, and there's 872 bottles of this, of which I have bottle number 302, which caused me pause, because generally when we do a single casking, it's about 200 bottles. How the heck do you get 872 bottles out of this? So let's do the math. This is a 700 milliliter bottle. We got 872 bottles. That would be 610.4 liters. So add in the angel share, racking launches, wood soak, and all that. We need a barrel at least 700 liters big. Are there sherry casks that big? Now, our normal sherry casks are bigger than bourbon casks. Bourbon casks are typically 200 liters when they're originally made. They're remade into 250s. But sherry casks typically come in 500s, right? Those are the butts. And those are generally what we call sherry season casks. You can buy these from the sherry distillers. They put sherry in it for as long as you want them to, and then sell you the barrel for about 1,000 euros. It comes from the old transport cask concept, but they don't do transport casks anymore. But there are bigger barrels. So the Puncheons, those are about 600 liter barrels. Now, those are real barrels used in bodegas typically for aging, secondary aging after you finish the bodega method. And they're much more expensive, 2,000 euros plus. But that's not big enough for making 872 bottles. No, if you were really going to do this, if this is what this is, it's actually got to be a bodega tonal barrel, which is a 700 liter barrel. I don't know how the heck he would have got one of these. These barrels are very thick, made of European oak. They're typically used for decades in the bodega process, that 3-tier process where they're moving from barrel to barrel. And look at the color on this whiskey. For 3 years in the bottle with no color treatment. That must have been a brand new barrel, which I went and priced one. If you can find one, and you probably can, 5,000 euros easy. For a little distillery, this seems insane. Right? Wow. And it's only going to be like this for this batch. And I would point out, this edition did win bronze at the World Whiskey Awards in 2026. So here I go. I've sold it up.
Have strong overtones of sherry, you think? Or?
Well, you would think with this much color.
Yeah.
This young, that smells like sherry. Holy man. Here we go. All right. I've got my little glass here. All that color. Yeah, very strong sherry, but no heat, right? This is quite gentle on the nose. It's not burning at all. What are we at? 46%? 46%. So typical, nothing, this is not cask strength then. Maybe that's how he got that many liters out of it. Maybe it came out of the barrel at 65%. He was able to cut it with water. Wow. Okay. Yeah, definitely a sherry cask, like through and through. Super smooth on the mouth, but grainy and fruity. Lots of heat now. More heat. Like I would almost think this was barrel strength with that much heat coming off of that. That's really nice. How Danish is this? Isn't that the question? We're going after the Danish terroir. I mean, in one sense, I could say it's very Danish in the sense that it's pleasant, right? Like most Danes I've ever met, they're kind of chilled out people. They got it going on. They know they live a great life. They tend to come in number one in their happiness factor for their country, and this whiskey rates up with that. This will make you happy. This is beautiful whiskey. Ready for the good news?
Yes.
You can't buy this. The 872 bottles are largely sold, so they are very hard to come by. And if you can happen to find one, they ran about $90 US, and they are not sold in the US. In fact, they are only sold in Denmark, France, Germany, Netherlands, and Sweden. Which is not surprising. That's not even all of the EU. But
not even all of Scandinavia.
Yeah. This distillery has not been in operation for very long, right? Really only started making booze in 2020. They do make a line of gin and schnapps. They call the gin Mad Owl after an owl they found in the stable when they were setting up. And the schnapps they call Fuckendell after the farm itself.
Careful.
So those are, what for the 3+ years that they were laying up barrels and not being able to sell anything, they decided to make some things. And the Mad Owl Gin won some awards. They've done pretty well with that. But this is as young gets. There's nothing but 3-year-olds. Thomas is still years away from getting the 12-year-old he promised himself. I hope he's got some barrels laid up to actually wait for a while. But yeah, it's a lovely whiskey. It's very drinkable. Super approachable. It's very Danish.